This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the In Focus podcast. I am G. Sampath. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit in Tianjin concluded on Monday. It saw Prime Minister Narendra Modi visit China for the first time in 7 years. He had a bilateral meeting with President Xi Jinping, which assumes significance in the context of the ongoing dissonance in India-US relations over tariffs. So how do we read the Modi-Xi meeting? Does it signal a shift toward normalization of bilateral ties, or is it just a photo op? How important is this particular summit in the history of the SCO and the challenges it faces today? And what tangible benefits can India expect from greater engagement with the SCO and with China in particular? We look for answers to all these questions in this episode of In Focus. And joining us today are Suhasini Haidar, the Hindu's diplomatic affairs editor, and Ananth Krishnan, director at the Hindu Group and former Beijing correspondent. Ananth has also just curated a new ebook for the Hindu on China titled China, India Perspectives on China's Politics, Economy and Foreign Relations. It is an anthology of 12 outstanding essays by reputed China scholars and experts. And as we unpack the SCO summit for you today, we will also be discussing this book. Ananth and Suhasini, welcome to the pod. Okay, Suhasini, I'll come to you first. I was just wondering, what exactly are your thoughts on the Tianjin Declaration, which has condemned the April 22nd Pahalgam attack? So is that a win for India?
Well, I certainly think having strong language on terrorism is a win, not just for India, but for the SCO itself, which was founded on the idea of combating what they call the three evils of terrorism, separatism, and radicalism. For India, it was important because just 2 months ago, there was an SCO defense ministers meeting that was to finalize this particular declaration, the Tianjin Declaration as it's known. And they weren't able to form a consensus over the references to terrorism. It's still a bit unclear exactly what was in that original document because that document never saw air. But certainly now we know that not only are there references very specific to the Pahalgam attacks, which India found important, but also to 2 attacks in Pakistan and Balochistan in particular, which seemed to be a way of bringing a consensus there. I think apart from that document, from the terrorism references in the document, it's important to notice that there was a new consensus on international developments as well. Just 2 months ago, again in June, India had refused to sign on to an SCO document that had criticized the US and Israel in particular for their attacks on Iran. If you remember, that was the big story 2 months ago. But in this particular declaration, India has got on board with everyone else and not only condemned the strikes by Israel and by the United States, it has very strong language about the humanitarian crisis, the starvation in Gaza as well. So we saw a sort of coming together of the SCO memberships of these countries that are, often seen as anti-Western, but basically led by Russia and China. It has the Central Asian countries in them. It has Iran, Belarus, India, and Pakistan. And it seemed as if there was a greater meeting of minds, if you like, on many of these issues. It's also important to remember, Sampath, that this is an organization India had been kind of giving short shrift to for the last couple of years. India, was to host the summit 2 years ago, and Prime Minister Modi decided to take the summit online, virtually, instead of having Xi Jinping and Putin come to Delhi at that time. Last year, Prime Minister Modi didn't attend the summit in Kazakhstan, even though he was confirmed. So it's interesting that India seems to have taken that step, and many, of course, making the speculation that it has as much to do with better ties with China as it has to do with worse ties with the United States.
Right. Suhasini, you were just saying that India has sort of given the short shrift to the SCO, and we didn't sign on to the Iran statement, just recently. But then now we have. Are we to assume that one of the things that have made us make this switch, so to speak, is the tariff question? And also, if you look at SCO by itself, there are all these contradictions. India and Pakistan, there is this contradiction in terms of, their their geopolitical interests. And there is also this divergence of interest, perhaps between Russia and China over Central Asia. And there are many other, internal dynamics within the SCO, which sort of give a lot of challenges as a grouping itself. So, how do you see this particular summit in terms of these challenges? Is it sort of opening up new avenues for cooperation and forward momentum?
Well, Sampath, one never knows how long-term these changes are, because we have seen these kind of ebbs and flows happen in the past as well when it comes to India and the SCO. Remember, India has been an observer of the SCO since, I think, 2005, 2006, but it only became a member in 2017, and it was admitted along with Pakistan. And the general belief was that Russia had pushed for India's membership and China had pushed for Pakistan's membership at the time. So it's not very comfortable, because for New Delhi, especially since Prime Minister Modi's refused to be part of SAARC summits, for example, simply because he'd have to be across the table from Pakistan and discuss issues like terrorism there. Yet both India and Pakistan show up for the SCO summit. Now, you asked about what brings them closer together in this particular time. And I think Prime Minister Modi's participation, his attendance at the SCO in Tianjin was probably decided nearly a year ago. In October last year, when he and President Xi met on the sidelines of a BRICS summit in Russia and decided to normalize ties between India and China after the LAC standoff, the 4-year military standoff, the Galwan clashes. We did expect that Prime Minister Modi would go to China, because this was a huge event for the Chinese government. This is certainly something they've been showcasing. It's part of a week-long series of events, if you like, because the scene has now shifted to Beijing. China is also hosting that parade for the World War II, victory. And Putin and Xi side by side a few months after they were together in Moscow for a similar kind of parade. These are all things China is looking to showcase to the world. China is looking to show itself not only as another pole, but a global leader who is now part of stabilizing the world. At that time, for Prime Minister Modi to be there would have been very important. And I think that's what his participation really signified. But I think the last few weeks, particularly even the last few days, whether it is the 50% tariffs from the US, whether it is the sanctions on India for the first time in 27 years, or whether it is, in fact, the comments made by Mr. Trump, whether it's on Pakistan, Operation Sindoor, the ceasefire and how it was mediated, as well as the extremely sharp attacks by the Trump administration on India. All of these, I think, have really led to perhaps kindling the warmth in Tianjin a lot more.
Right. Suhasini, one more question to you before I bring Ananth into this aspect. You spoke about China wanting to showcase, Modi, Xi, and Putin, and this entire dynamic. There is also the other side here, where India, I think, would be very happy to showcase Prime Minister Modi with the heads of these two major powers. And as today's newspaper page ones we have seen everywhere, that seems to be the focus. So what I want to understand is this for India? Is this more about showcasing this as a photo op to the West, or is there something substantial in terms of economic or geopolitical cooperation with China where we are making some kind of progress?
Well, very astutely put, Sampath, because it is true that this troika in town, in Tianjin, of Xi, Modi and Putin is certainly something that New Delhi is definitely also showcasing. We saw the way Prime Minister Modi virtually, sort of grabbed Mr. Putin by the hand, and then they walked up to Mr. Xi, and then we saw all three of them conversing together. The way the photographs were taken and put out by the Prime Minister's office, I don't think there's any doubt that Delhi wants to send this message out. It would have been a very different kind of photo op had that not been the case. And we've seen similar photo ops, for example, at the SCO in 2022, where there wasn't this kind of bonhomie between the three of them. I do think it is also important in terms of putting out the message that there are alternatives in the world. At a time when the United States has stepped up this relentless attack on the issue of trade. And remember, they're still threatening another 100% or something in tariffs against the BRICS organization members. as a whole, it was important to say, not everybody is in the Western camp. And there are all these leaders. It is also interesting from Prime Minister Modi's own schedule in Tianjin, if you notice, he really didn't have a lot of bilateral meetings. Normally, the SCO is a time when he packs it with many bilateral meetings because all the Central Asian leadership is there. A lot of the South Asian leadership was there as well, from Nepal, from Maldives. He met General Min Aung Hlaing from Myanmar. But apart from that, his only two big bilateral meetings, 45, 50 minutes each, was with Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi. So that message was going out quite clearly.
Right. Ananth, as India and China seek to accelerate this normalization of ties, which began last year, as Suhasini was pointing out, how do you read the situation with regard to the border and territory issues that we've had since 2020 Galwan confrontation, where we lost 20 Indian soldiers? Are our concerns still on the table right now, or have we sort of put them on the back burner? I mean, to put it differently, is there a danger of us sort of taking it slightly more easy on the border question in exchange for a photo opportunity in the context of the Trump tariff issue?
Well, Sampath, I wouldn't put it exactly in those terms, but I think it's clear that there's been a shifting in terms of India's stated expectations and red lines for re-engaging China. Initially, I think the very clear message in the first 2-3 years of the standoff that, of course, went on for 5 years was that it had to be normal at the borders to have a normal relationship. Right now, I think even on record, India's military has said on several occasions that the borders were stable but not normal. So I think they've kind of shifted a little bit in terms of what they see as conditions that permit this kind of re-engaging with China, which is they've had a few months of peace and stability on the borders, but they're very clear that the situation is nowhere near normal. In terms of the broader situation, it's only disengagement that's happened. Conversations on the next two steps, which involve both sides de-escalating and de-inducting the 50 to 60,000 troops on each side. There are still in forward areas. That's a long way off. But I think that for various reasons, I think Delhi had to come to the conclusion that they had to re-engage China after completing disengagement, which, of course, I think was the most concerning requirement. Obviously, that's where you had the highest likelihood of a conflict breaking out again between the two sides. So clearly, there has been a shift in Delhi's stand. But at the same time, I think, Sampath, something we can also speak about, I think there also has to be a sense of reflection in Delhi in terms of its broader China policy and what its long-term objectives are in engaging with China, because you've seen this very big change while there hasn't really been a public explanation for what brought about that change.
Right. Ananth, speaking of this entire dynamic with China right now, you've just curated an excellent book on China, which looks at broadening India's understanding of China and not just approach it from the security lens, so to speak. And I was just wondering, I was just asking the same question to Suhasini yesterday during the conversation. The Chinese seem to expect from us that, okay, there is this border issue that we are not able to solve right now. Let's move on to the other things, the easier things to solve, to do with the economy, export restrictions and other kinds of things like for Chinese investment in India, so on and so forth. Whereas the Indian position so far has been, let's first fix the border thing, let's get some momentum on that, and then we will talk about the other things. So is there a cultural difference in terms of approaching negotiations and conflict resolution here? The Chinese seem to be stuck on this, and we are stuck on this, and this seems to be the broader framework in which the talks are happening right now. Is there something that we could do differently in this context? Are we reading them right?
No, I think that's absolutely a fair characterization of how both sides look at it. And I think the reason partly why you hear the Chinese often saying shelve it is I really haven't seen anything that suggests that they want to resolve this with any sense of finality, because I think there's a deep-seated tendency to look at the border and an unsettled border as something that is an easy way for China to keep India in check on its toes, to destabilize it if needed. It's also an easy way for India to kind of be tied down on the land borders and have resource constraints when it comes to the other arena where India and China are kind of rubbing up, which is India's naval modernization. And obviously, India has finite resources. So I've never really seen any clear indication that China wants to resolve this with any sense of finality, because you also have this feeling that you often hear Chinese experts saying, well, if you settle this, you're going to free up India to do more with the US and the Quad. So what does China gain from this? That's a very sort of common line of reasoning that you hear. And from India's side, it's been interesting. Very recently, of course, you had a meeting of the special representatives on the boundary question, Ajit Doval and Wang Yi. And there was another subtle change, Sampath, where India has previously only spoken of having a package solution in all sectors, but you heard for the first time an Indian reference to a long pending sort of a Chinese proposal, which is an early harvest in one of the sectors where there are fewer differences. So to hear India actually invoke that, I found that quite interesting. And obviously, there's very little said in the public domain about it. But again, it speaks to perhaps a different view of looking at the boundary. I don't think this means India is going to give up its posture. India has done a lot in the last 4 or 5 years in terms of infrastructure improvements in border areas. India's capabilities now are far greater than they were 5-6 years ago. So I don't think you're going to see that slow down. But from what you see emerging publicly, it does seem to reflect a little subtle change in what Delhi seems to be looking at in terms of the boundary question with China.
On this boundary aspect, another one very specific question for you. See, from what you can correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I understand, what used to be our patrolling areas have now turned into buffer zones where we cannot go anymore, or at least not go without taking the Chinese guys into confidence. Now, is that something we're going to be discussing with the Chinese going forward, or if you're going to say, okay, the border is stable now, is there a danger of this sort of becoming a de facto thing?
But I think, of course, the buffer zones are what officially India prefers to call no patrolling zones, and they insist are a temporary measure. I think that it's something that both sides have used previously, even in 2013 and 14, as a way to diffuse tensions. I also do think that, speaking to people on the Indian military side of things, there is a growing sense that there's a question mark on whether you really do need to patrol every inch up to your claim lines in an era where you have drones and other ways of verification, especially if it requires the other side to similarly not patrol. But I think the bigger concern is, even if this is a good medium-term solution in boundary areas where obviously it makes no sense to have patrols encountering each other just for the sake of marking territory, which has led to problems over the last 2 years, the concern is how this came about. The fact that it came about because of clear Chinese coercion on the boundary, and the fact that there really hasn't been a very clear public accounting or explanation of what we've agreed to with China. I think that's led to very legitimate questions about what the arrangements on the boundary are, over which there's very little clarity. But I do think that both sides are aware that they need to find a new way to manage the boundary, and that's why at the last round, they've come up with a joint working group to look at mechanisms to beef up how they deal with the boundary. But part of me, Sampath, sometimes I feel you've seen this film before, where every 3-4 years they come up with conversations about this, but ultimately the structural differences and the contest on the border is so stark that these mechanisms usually come under increasing tension, and then you have the cycle of incidents repeating again.
Right, that's absolutely true. We have seen this film before. I mean, that's a sentiment I think many Indians will certainly share. Now, moving on to the economic side of things. Now, India is looking to deepen economic ties with China. I mean, we are under pressure because of these tariffs, and even also with the global economy stalling, so to speak. We need to explore all our options. But then we have a problem in the case of China, which is a massive trade deficit. So, Ananth, do we have a clear play on how to bridge this deficit? What can we possibly sell to China? What can China import from us other than raw materials? Or are we okay with sort of going ahead as a quote-unquote junior economic partner in this relationship?
I think one thing that the last 4-5 years really served a reality check was in terms of some of the structural dependencies that India has on China. and the fact that I think it is extremely unrealistic for India to try to completely decouple from not just the world's second largest economy, but a neighbor and a country that has such a huge presence in supply chains in almost every sector that India needs. So I think there's been a big reality check in terms of how much India can decouple from China. But I think what they've tried to do is on the investment front, put up some barriers to prevent China from coming into sensitive sectors. But just to take a step back, Sampath, I think it really speaks more to the point that I was making earlier on the lack of a long-term strategy to deal with China. I don't think that the boundary incidents in April, May 2020 came out of the blue and were reasons for India to do a complete flip in terms of how it was engaging with China. From 2014 to 2018-19 onwards, there was a concerted approach to get Chinese investments in. You had Chinese companies become investors in almost every big Indian startup, which not necessarily is a bad thing in the sense that the argument at the time was that you're creating stakes for China in India. But then you had this complete reversal, again, without a clear explanation or argument for why that happened. And not just on the investment front, but for 5 years, India also stopped Chinese tourists from coming, Chinese students from coming. And I think there has to be a reflection on, do we create certain aspects of our engagement with China that will be durable, especially when they don't really have a direct, I would argue they don't really have a direct impact on border security. Do we want to have a more complex, nuanced engagement with China where you do take a very clear, firm stance when it comes to hard security, but yet you engage in other areas? Or on the other hand, are we going to continue with this approach where you let incidents decide how you engage with China without really a clear, consistent policy?
Right. On this question of Chinese investments, to what extent we allow it, when did we start allowing them, when did we start cutting them short? Suhasini, do you want to come in on this? I mean, there were some security concerns, some press notes, etc., on this question which were talked about. Like, where do we stand as of today with regard to inviting or encouraging Chinese investment in India, and also in this particular juncture, with regard to outcomes on the economic front around this Tianjin summit? There's been talk of visas being sort of the issue of visas coming up again, resumption of direct flights, etc. So, are there any clear economic pathways that we're looking at right now?
Well, we're still waiting to hear about the full outcomes of the meeting between Modi and Xi, and that lasted, we're told, about 50 minutes. But it is a fact that while they have come to some kind of arrangement or agreement when it comes to the border tensions, and they have already restarted, the visas being given, they've already restarted the Kailash Mansarovar Yatra. We're still waiting to hear on how exactly the easing of trade restrictions between the two sides is going to continue. Remember, India had been very concerned because China had in April put these export restrictions on things like critical minerals, rare earth magnets, fertilizers, tunnel boring machines. China, of course, has been complaining since 2020, and you refer to a press note. That was essentially an Indian ruling. It was called Press Note 3. That came out in April, even before the tensions at the LAC had begun between the two militaries, restricting any kind of investment from border countries, but basically aimed at China, from being able to invest in Indian companies without Home Ministry clearance. And this really slowed the process of Chinese investments in India down. It wasn't just issues like the Mundra port, but there were many issues over, car companies that wanted to sell, Ford wanted to sell, General Motors wanted to sell, and the only buyers they were finding were Chinese buyers, but there was no clearance for those. We also saw India put a kind of go slow on imports from China. But very quickly it emerged that these were causing real ruptures in India's supply chain resilience. And over time, India has also noticed that its imports from China have only increased. In the last few years, the bilateral trade deficit in China's favor is over $100 billion. So it's a question of how quickly they can move on these issues to dismantle these huge kind of walls between the two sides on trade issues, and whether particularly for the Indian side, they can get over the security concerns they have. Because, of course, India has had many concerns, not just about this kind of investment in Indian companies, but on espionage, corporate espionage. There are all the cases against Chinese companies. What happens to those now? China has been very keen to see those being taken down. So I think we have to pause before we decide this is a complete reset with China. But certainly trade will hold one of the big keys in showing the way forward, because this comes at a time when America and India's relationship, also so economically interlinked, does seem to be coming apart. And if America persists with its 50% tariffs, even its 25%, which is the tariff component, and takes away the sanctions component of the tariffs on India, I do think that there are going to be long-term concerns about the resilience of India-US trade as well. So at this particular time, to have this kind of opening with China could actually lead to a lot more. But just how much more, I think the next few weeks are going to tell us.
Right. On this question of Chinese investments in India and what India can possibly export to China that is not a raw material, Ananth, I was just wondering if you had any thoughts. I had asked the same question to Cameron in a podcast last week, and he was suggesting that Cameron is a Shanghai-based businessman, entrepreneur. So he was suggesting that perhaps Chinese businessmen, entrepreneurs could establish a certain manufacturing units in India, which could then export those things to China, because Chinese manufacturing is shifting, they're upskilling, and there are certain things which they would rather, build outside China, maybe Vietnam and India and so on. Do you see that kind of a thing working out, Ananth, for India?
I think the difficulty in that, Sampath, is the last 5 years have kind of sent a clear message to Chinese companies and businessmen, some of whom I've interacted with on their visits to India, for example, that they don't think India is an open market or destination for investment for Chinese companies. I do think that the exact pathway that you mentioned was something that was in the minds of Chinese companies before COVID and before the restrictions that Suhasini mentioned, and she correctly mentioned, came into place before the border clashes in April 2020. So I do think that they feel India is too difficult to market. A lot of media attention in China has been focused on some of the cases involving Chinese companies. Some of them have had all of their earnings in India frozen, and they cannot repatriate those earnings back to China over tax investigations. So I don't see much appetite at all as far as Chinese companies are concerned, or at least much diminished appetite from what was clearly there 4 or 5 years ago to actually come to India and invest in factories and plants. Some of those high-profile investments haven't really taken off. You've had Chinese car companies that wanted to invest in a plant in Gujarat. As far as I know, that hasn't taken off. You had a very big investment in Haryana from Wanda, which a huge real estate company in China that then ran into financial.
Wasn't BYD also interested in setting up a plant somewhere?
I think BYD does have a facility already in South India, and they do a little bit of manufacturing for the Indian market. But broadly speaking, you've had very few cases of really big Chinese projects coming up in India, and those that were announced, especially during the honeymoon phase of 2018-19, didn't really subsequently materialize. And the other thing that you kind of hear from Chinese companies is they say, well, the traditional pathway they follow in other markets is they export a lot to a particular country, and when they're pretty certain there's a market for their goods, then it kind of gradually evolves into manufacturing for that market. In terms of Chinese phone companies, I think that's worth highlighting, because a lot of assembly is happening in India now, far more than was the case a decade ago. But in terms of how much of those components are being manufactured in India, I don't think very much of that is happening. It's more a case of assembly. So I think there's a limited potential for that, Sampath. But I do think one thing you're going to see a lot more of is, even though India put in these investment restrictions from China, you're probably going to see a lot more what China did in the 80s and 90s, which is a joint venture type of arrangement where you insist that the company that comes in gets an Indian partner that owns 50 or 51% stake. So I think that's something you might see more of going forward, rather than Chinese companies coming in on their own and taking the risks of what they see as very big risks of doing business in India.
Right. I mean, there is a risk for them on doing business in India, and there is also a risk for us in terms of Chinese investments. There is beyond a certain point, there is a question of security. There is a question of data, and one of the ways in which, for instance, the Indonesians have navigated is that they limit Chinese investment to a fixed number, and then they get the UAE businessmen, UAE companies from the Middle East to do the bulk of the funding, and then get the Chinese to build their bridges or metros or whatever, and that way they are able to get Chinese involvement in terms of technology transfer and so on, without getting Chinese capital involved in a big way. Do you think India can explore that option as well, because it seems to have worked with another global South country?
I think that's partly the rationale and why you're beginning to see agreements that have actually been given permission in the last 6 months or so. And those, as I just mentioned, were kind of a joint venture type of approach where I think Indian regulators feel a little bit assuaged by the fact that it will be an Indian company kind of leading the project, having a majority stake in the project. It's still early doors. You haven't really seen any of these come to fruition in a big way, but I think that seems to be one pathway that both countries are exploring. But I do think that India will probably eventually have to have a slightly more nuanced approach to screening investment from China. It went, of course, from one extreme of complete openness from 2014 to 19. It went to the other extreme in 2020 of almost preventing all investments, requiring permission, and few permissions were granted. I think they do probably need to come to the realization that in some sectors, if India wants capital, if India wants technology, and where India sees less risk, it should probably have a slightly nuanced approach. And of course, continue where I do think they took the right decision, for example, in something like 5G, where they kept Chinese companies out of the trial, even after they had a big role in 3G and 4G. So I think you could continue having this kind of nuanced approach depending on the sector, rather than a blanket approach either way.
Right. We are running out of time. So one last question to both of you before we wrap up. In the context of this SCO summit and bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi, the slogan we've been hearing is partners and not rivals. So is this just a very catchy slogan, or is there real scope for India and China to build on this principle for the longer term, especially given that we are also very concerned about how this whole thing will impinge on Indo-US ties? Suhasini, you want to weigh in on this first?
Well, there isn't any way of knowing how long this can last. Because firstly, things with the US may in fact improve if either side compromises, or we see Mr. Trump coming for the Quad summit to India. And, these are all leaders who are able to turn the foreign policy of countries on a whim, on a personal grudge even. So that's one part of it, is the longevity of these pronouncements. Because remember, not a year ago, we even had External Affairs Minister Jaishankar saying in Parliament, castigating a previous government for having signed a strategic partnership with China, and said, how can these people see a country like China as partners, given what they have done at the line of actual control? And it's not just border tensions, which have been a perennial cause of tensions between India and China, except for maybe one period in between. But, tensions over China's support to Pakistan, more recently over Operation Sindoor, China's rejection of, terror designations that India has wanted at the United Nations, China's blocking of India at various multilateral organizations, including the Nuclear Suppliers Group. So there is a litany of woes, if you like, at the back of this relationship. And China has many issues with India as well on the restrictions India puts.
On this same level, you also have things like the Trump administration hosting and feting Field Marshal Asim Munir.
And that actually should be a reminder to India that rather than finding comfort in either one side, and becoming in a sense a kind of a pawn in a larger geopolitical game, it's much more important to stick to India's original principles. And I think that's what you're hearing a lot more of in recent weeks: the need for India to reset its foreign policy, look within, look more at at working, say, with the global south, or dare I say, working a little better with the neighborhood. But I think, Sampath, these are going to be real questions. Is it possible to trust the United States again after what we've seen in the last few months? Will it be possible to trust China? Of course, Russia has come out as a much more dependable partner, but then that's something India has had to recognize as well. I think what we are seeing is a moment of inflection. And it is not yet clear which way India will go. It may seem from the photo ops and from the optics that we have moved away from one pole of the world and are now very closely aligned to another. But I think this is still about to play out.
On this question of Russia coming out as a dependable partner, again, so that we don't end up feeling betrayed like we felt with China and the US, how much of it is really, quote unquote, friendship and trust, and how much of it is Russia sort of playing the card, keeping China in mind, with regard to India?
Well, the India-Russia relationship is based on this idea of trust between India and the Soviet Union. Much of it is about history, about the role that Russia played, including, of course, in 1971, where India and the Soviet Union had at that time signed a friendship and cooperation treaty. So some of it is a mythology, some of it is genuine feeling.
So, even within the Soviet era, Suhasini, wasn't there an element of the tensions between the falling out, so to speak, between Maoist China and the Soviet Union at that point of time, sort of leading Russia to support?
And India was in a sense a beneficiary of that as well. I think India's own position of trying to stick at that time to non-aligned principles is about giving itself space to have these kind of partnerships. And it's interesting that in the last few years, since 2022, there's been a revival of that idea that if India says it is not aligned, it is able to, in a sense, broaden its opportunities with different countries in the world. Unfortunately, suddenly the world has become so polarized that we are now beginning to see so many countries say you have to choose. But when it has come to India and Russia, neither side has really made that claim on the other. Instead, they've worked on the areas where they work very closely together. And even if you put all the oil imports that only really began 3 years ago aside, you're looking at the defense equipment, you're looking at spare parts, you're looking at the nuclear industry, where Russia is the only non-Indian player inside India in civil nuclear power. You're looking at the kind of support both sides have given each other when it comes to the United Nations. In the old days, it was Russia protecting India from UNSC resolutions, especially on Kashmir. While India was in the UNSC a couple of years ago, it was India that was abstaining on vote after vote against Russia. So for better or for worse, they seem to have found a way of having each other's back, if you like. And I think that plays out very much in the relationship right now.
Right, that's absolutely a valid point, Suhasini. Thank you for explaining that. Ananth, what is your take on this partners, not rivals principle, so to speak?
I think, Sampath, if you look at the balance sheet of the relationship and what would come under the partners column and what would come under the column of differences and problems, it's very, very clear. It's heavily skewed towards problems India has with China. I think the challenge both now face is there a way for them to, obviously they cannot solve the problems. I think the ceiling for the relationship is, can you keep the problems managed while you find limited ways to work together? I don't think the recent visit means a reset. I don't think there's any way of turning the clock back, and I don't think the relationship between India and China will ever probably go back to what it was before we had this freeze of the last 5 years. I think the challenge more is to find a workable relationship. I think to go back to Suhasini's point, I think the churn that you've seen over the last few years only underlines that India has to, as she says, look within and find an independent foreign policy, have a better relationship with its immediate neighborhood. And I think part of that, ultimately, if India's focus is to develop, part of that is going to be managing its relationship with China, which isn't going anywhere, while finding a way to protect its interests. I think partners, not rivals, may be overstating it. But I think the more modest goal should be to try and find a little bit of way to balance a very skewed negative balance sheet that we've seen over the last few years.
Right. I mean, I think if you were to sort of define the Tianjin moment, perhaps it's not really a reset in India-China relations, but definitely a pointer to the need for a reset in India's foreign policy and work towards a more independent and sustainable foreign policy. Thank you so much, Ananth. Thank you so much, Suhasini. Pleasure talking to you both.
Thank you.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.